After losing his fortune in a scam orchestrated by his own son, the millionaire is kicked out of his home. Now he has to work as a rideshare driver to survive. One of his passengers is the woman he left behind for a life of luxury, and she recognizes him immediately. The cell phone vibrated on the car console, announcing a new race. Garrett Mason sighed, his wrinkled fingers gripping the worn steering wheel of the 2010 Honda Civic. He slid his finger over the cracked screen, accepting the ride. "Arrival in 3 minutes," the app announced. As he maneuvered through the busy streets of Chicago, Garrett barely recognized his reflection in the rearview mirror. His unkempt gray hair and unshaven beard contrasted dramatically with the polished image he had maintained for decades. The deep circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights, worrying about overdue bills and the daily struggle to survive. Just 6 months ago, Garrett was the CEO of Mason Enterprises, one of the largest real estate developers in Illinois. His life was a parade of meetings in boardrooms, dinners in starred restaurants, and weekends at his country home. Now, his reality boiled down to a small rented apartment in the suburbs and long hours driving to earn enough to pay the rent. Garrett stopped in front of an elegant apartment building on the Gold Coast, the neighborhood he used to call home. His eyes scanned the imposing facade, remembering the extravagant parties he used to throw in his penthouse. A lump formed in his throat. "Mr. Mason?" A female voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Garrett turned, meeting his passenger's eyes. His heart stopped. "Charlotte?" he whispered, hardly believing his eyes. Charlotte Parker, now in her 50s, still radiated the same beauty that had captivated him 3 decades ago. Her brown hair was sprinkled with silver strands, and small wrinkles marked the corners of her eyes. But it was her, the woman he had left behind in search of a life of wealth and status. "My God, Garrett," Charlotte murmured, the surprise evident in her voice. "Is it really you?" Garrett felt the weight of 25 years of regret come crashing down on his shoulders. "Yes, Charlotte, it's me." A heavy silence filled the car as Charlotte climbed into the back seat. Garrett could feel her gaze, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and something he couldn't decipher. "Where to, ma'am?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse. Charlotte gave the address of a restaurant in the center, and Garrett started driving, his thoughts in a whirl. How to explain to her what had happened? How to tell her that his son, Ryan, the boy Charlotte had helped raise, had betrayed him and stolen everything? "So, an app driver?" Charlotte broke the silence, her voice a mixture of incredulity and something close to compassion. Garrett laughed bitterly. "Life takes turns, doesn't it? One day you're on top of the world, the next." He let the sentence die, unable to finish it. "What happened, Garrett?" Charlotte asked softly. "The last I heard of you, Mason Enterprises was about to close a multi-million-dollar deal." Garrett swallowed dryly, his hands clenching the steering wheel. "It was Ryan," he finally said, the words coming out like a painful confession. He set the whole thing up, forged documents, embezzled funds, made me sign papers I shouldn't have. By the time I realized it, it was too late. The company was bankrupt and I was being investigated for fraud." Charlotte was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Oh, Garrett," she whispered at last. "I'm so sorry." The compassion in her voice was almost unbearable. Garrett fought back the tears that threatened to fall. "I've lost everything, Charlotte. My house, my car, my savings. Ryan disappeared with the money, and I was left with nothing." The streets of Chicago passed by in a blur as Garrett continued driving, his past and present colliding in a surreal way. He could feel Charlotte's gaze burning into the back of his head, loaded with unasked questions and unspoken words. "Did you try to contact him?" Charlotte asked after a moment. Garrett shook his head. "He's changed all his numbers, blocked my emails. It's as if he's disappeared off the face of the earth." He paused, swallowing the knot in his throat. "But even if I could find him, what would I say? How could I look my own son in the eye and ask why he betrayed me?" Charlotte sighed, a sound full of sadness and understanding. "Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the most," she said softly. The words hit Garrett like a punch in the gut. He knew that Charlotte wasn't just talking about Ryan. She was also talking about himself, about the day he chose ambition and money over the love they shared. "Charlotte, Garrett began, but was interrupted by the GPS announcing that they had reached their destination. He stopped the car in front of the restaurant, an elegant establishment he used to frequent in its heyday. Now, it seemed to belong to a world of which he was no longer a part. Charlotte hesitated before getting out of the car. "Garrett," she said, her voice soft, "would you like to have a coffee sometime, to talk?" Garrett turned, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. There was a kindness in them that he didn't deserve, an offer of, what? Forgiveness? Reconciliation? He didn't know, but he felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest for the first time in months. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice trembling. Charlotte nodded, a small smile curving her lips. She scribbled her number on a piece of paper and handed it to Garrett before getting out of the car. "Call me," she said simply. As Garrett watched Charlotte enter the restaurant, he felt something change inside him. The crushing weight of defeat and regret that had been with him for months seemed to ease a little. There, holding the piece of paper with Charlotte's number on it, he felt a glimmer of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a story of falling and betrayal. Maybe it could be a story of redemption, of second chances. And as Garrett started the car for his next run, he allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to feel a little hope. The day went on, with Garrett picking up passenger after passenger, but his mind remained fixed on his unexpected encounter with Charlotte. Every face that entered his car seemed blurred, every conversation a distant murmur as he relived those few precious minutes. As the sun began to set, painting the Chicago sky in shades of orange and pink, Garrett finally decided to call it a day. He parked the car on a quiet street, away from the hustle and bustle of the city center, and picked up the piece of paper Charlotte had given him. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed the number into his cell phone. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the call button. What if she had changed her mind? What if the number was a fake, just a courtesy to avoid an embarrassing scene? Taking a deep breath, Garrett pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Hello?" Charlotte's voice sounded on the other end of the line, bringing back a wave of memories. "Charlotte? It's Garrett," he said, his voice firmer than he expected. There was a pause, and then, "Hi, Garrett. I've been expecting your call." Her words ignited a spark of hope in his chest. I was thinking about that coffee," Garrett said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Are you still interested?" "Yes," Charlotte replied without hesitation. "How about tomorrow morning? I know a great cafe near Millennium Park." They agreed on the details, and when Garrett hung up the phone, he felt lighter than he had in months. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new chance. And for the first time since his life fell apart, Garrett Mason was looking forward to the future. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as Garrett entered the small cafe on the edge of Millennium Park. His eyes roamed around the cozy atmosphere, with its exposed brick walls and hanging plants, until they found Charlotte sitting at a table in the corner, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup. He hesitated for a moment, straightening the simple shirt he had meticulously ironed that morning. It was nothing compared to the Italian suits he used to wear, but it was the best he could do now. Taking a deep breath, he approached. "Hi, Charlotte," Garrett said softly. She looked up, a warm smile forming on her lips. "Hello, Garrett. Please, have a seat." As he settled down, a young waitress approached. "What can I get you, sir?" "Just a black coffee, please," Garrett replied, conscious of the light weight of his wallet in his pocket. Charlotte watched him over the rim of her cup, her brown eyes as penetrating as ever. "You look different," she commented. Garrett laughed humorlessly. "You mean older and more tired?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "More real, maybe, less polished." Her words took him by surprise. For a moment, Garrett didn't know how to respond. "I suppose losing everything does that to a person," he finally said. The waitress returned with Garrett's coffee, providing a break in the conversation. He took a sip, savoring the bitter taste. It was a reminder of how things had changed. Before, he only drank the most expensive blends, imported from exotic places. Now, simple coffee from a local cafe seemed like a luxury. "Garrett," Charlotte began, her voice soft but firm. "What really happened? With you, with Ryan, with everything?" He sighed, putting his cup down on the table. "It's a long story, Charlotte." "We have time," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. And so Garrett began to tell it. He talked about how Mason Enterprises grew beyond his wildest expectations, how success intoxicated him, blinding him to what really mattered. He talked about Ryan, the prodigy son he had raised to be his successor, and how the boy seemed to have inherited his ambition but none of his scruples. "I should have known," Garrett said, guilt evident in his voice. "The signs were there. Ryan was getting greedier, more impatient. But I was so proud of his success that I ignored the warnings." Charlotte listened in silence, her eyes full of compassion. When Garrett got to the part about Ryan's betrayal, her voice faltered. "He forged my signature on crucial documents, Charlotte. He siphoned millions into offshore accounts. When I finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The company was bankrupt. I was being investigated for fraud. And Ryan had disappeared with all the money." Garrett stopped, swallowing the knot in his throat. Charlotte reached out, covering his hand with her own. The touch was comforting, a reminder of a connection he thought he'd lost forever. "I'm sorry, Garrett," she said softly. "No one deserves to go through that, especially at the hands of their own son." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice again, it was hoarse with emotion. "The worst thing of all, Charlotte, is that I can't help thinking that somehow I deserved it. That this is some kind of cosmic punishment for all the people I've hurt along the way. For hurting you." Charlotte's eyes widened at the unexpected confession. "Garrett." "No, please, let me finish," he said, holding up a hand. "I was a fool, Charlotte. I traded true love for money and status. I thought I could have it all, but in the end, I ended up with nothing. And now I'd give anything to go back and do things differently." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions and shared regrets. Charlotte withdrew her hand from his, and for a terrible moment, Garrett thought she would leave. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photo. "Do you remember this?" she asked, sliding the photo across the table. Garrett picked up the image, and his heart leapt. It was a picture of them, much younger, in a park. He had his arm around Charlotte, and they were both smiling radiantly at the camera. In the background, a small child, Ryan, was playing on a swing. "Our first picnic as a family," Garrett murmured, the memories flooding his mind. "You've kept it all this time." Charlotte nodded. "Sometimes I look at that photo and wonder how things would have been different if we'd stayed together. If we'd raised Ryan together?" The implication of her words hung in the air between them. Garrett felt a twinge of guilt mixed with a spark of hope. "Charlotte, But before he could finish, Charlotte's cell phone rang, breaking the moment. She looked at the screen and frowned. "Sorry, I have to take this. It's work." As Charlotte walked away to take the call, Garrett stared at the photo, lost in thought. He barely noticed when she returned, a worried look on her face. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Charlotte sighed, putting the phone away. "That was my boss. There's been an emergency at the office and they need me there immediately." She hesitated, looking reluctant to leave. "Garrett, I'd like to continue this conversation. There's a lot more we need to discuss." He nodded, feeling a mixture of disappointment and relief. "I understand. Perhaps we can meet again soon." "I'd like that," Charlotte smiled, standing up. She took a business card from her bag and handed it to Garrett. "Here's my card. Call me when you can, and we'll set something up." Garrett took the card, his fingers lightly brushing hers. "Thank you, Charlotte, for everything." She smiled once more before turning to leave. Garrett watched her go, the business card safe in his hand and the photo still on the table in front of him. As he finished his now cold coffee, he couldn't help feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was the chance he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Leaving the cafe, Garrett found himself walking aimlessly through the streets of Chicago. The city buzzed with activity around him, but he hardly noticed. His mind was filled with memories of the past he had shared with Charlotte, of the future he had thrown away, and of the possibilities that now seemed to be opening up in front of him. He stopped on a bridge over the Chicago River, watching the boats pass below. Charlotte's card weighed heavy in his pocket, a tangible promise of a new beginning. But as Garrett gazed at the choppy waters of the river, he couldn't help but wonder, did he deserve this second chance? The answer, he realized, would not come easily. But for the first time in a long time, Garrett Mason was willing to fight for something other than wealth and status. He was ready to fight for redemption. The shrill sound of the alarm clock roused Garrett from a restless sleep. He stirred in the narrow bed, his eyes adjusting to the dimness of the small apartment he now called home. For a moment, disorientation overwhelmed him. Where were the silk curtains, the memory foam mattress, the smell of freshly ground coffee? Reality hit him like a bucket of cold water. This was his world now, a one-bedroom apartment in the Chicago suburbs, furnished with second-hand pieces and bitter memories. Garrett stood up with a groan, his muscles protesting after another long day behind the wheel. As he prepared for another day at work, his thoughts wandered to Charlotte and their conversation over coffee. Her business card was still on his bedside table, a beacon of possibility amid the chaos of his life. He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over Charlotte's number. Should he call? Was it too soon? What would he say? Before he could make a decision, his driver app beeped, alerting him to an upcoming race. Garrett sighed, putting his phone back in his pocket. The reunion with Charlotte would have to wait. Now it was time to work. The hours dragged by as Garrett navigated Chicago's traffic, picking up and dropping off passengers. Each face mingled with the next, superficial conversations filling the silence between destinations. But his mind was elsewhere, constantly reliving his conversation with Charlotte, imagining what could have been, what could still be. It was in the middle of the afternoon, during a rare moment of calm, that Garrett finally plucked up the courage to call Charlotte. His heart hammered in his chest as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Charlotte Parker speaking," came the professional reply. "Charlotte, it's Garrett," he said, his voice huskier than he had intended. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then, "Garrett, how nice to hear your voice." Relief flooded him. "Sorry if I'm calling at a bad time. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight. I know it's not much of a warning, but—" "I'd love to," Charlotte interrupted him, her voice soft. "Actually, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." Intrigued and a little apprehensive, Garrett arranged to meet her at a small Italian restaurant not far from where he was parked. As he hung up, he couldn't help wondering what Charlotte wanted to discuss. Would it be about their past? About Ryan? Or maybe— Garrett shook his head, dismissing the foolish hopes. He had no right to expect anything from Charlotte, not after the way he had treated her. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of unfamiliar streets and faces. When the time finally came to meet Charlotte, Garrett was a nervous wreck. He parked the car and entered the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room until they found Charlotte, sitting at a table at the back. She looked beautiful, wearing a navy blue dress that highlighted her eyes. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made Garrett's heart skip a beat. "Hi," he said, taking a seat at the table. You look great." Charlotte blushed slightly. "Thanks, Garrett. You don't look too bad yourself." They placed their orders, Garrett opting for the cheapest dish on the menu, and fell into an easy conversation about their day. For a moment, it was almost like old times, before ambition and greed had entered their lives. But Garrett could sense an underlying tension, an expectation in the air. Finally, after the waiter brought their plates, he could no longer contain his curiosity. "Charlotte," he began, putting his fork aside, "you mentioned that there was something you wanted to discuss with me." She nodded, her face turning serious. Yes, there is something. Garrett, I've been thinking a lot since our meeting at the cafe. About the past, about Ryan, about us. Garrett's heart raced. Charlotte took a deep breath. And I think maybe we can help each other. Confused, Garrett tilted his head. What do you mean? Well, Charlotte began, fiddling nervously with her napkin. As you know, I work as a private investigator now, and I have connections, people who can help locate Ryan. Garrett felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Do you think you can find him? Charlotte nodded slowly. I think so. But Garrett, I need you to understand, if we find Ryan, things could get complicated. Legally, emotionally, in every way. Garrett swallowed, his mind spinning with the implications. Finding Ryan would mean confronting not only his son, but also his own past, his own failings as a father. Why would you do that for me, Charlotte? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes softened. Because, despite everything, Garrett, I care about you. And because Ryan, well, in a way, he's my son too. I raised him for years, remember? Garrett nodded, remembering Ryan's early years, when Charlotte was a constant presence in their lives. Before ambition blinded him, before he threw everything away for an empty dream of wealth and power. And what do you want in return? He asked, knowing there had to be a catch. Charlotte hesitated for a moment. I want the truth, Garrett. All of it. About what happened to the company, about Ryan, about why you left us. I think that after all these years, I deserve to know. Garrett felt the weight of decades of secrets and regrets pressing down on his shoulders. But looking into Charlotte's eyes, he saw something he didn't deserve, but desperately craved. Understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. All right, he said at last. I'll tell you everything. But Charlotte, are you sure you want to get involved in this? It could be dangerous. She reached across the table, her fingers lightly brushing his. Garrett, I'm already involved. I have been since the day I met you. At that moment, sitting in a small Italian restaurant with the woman he should never have let go, Garrett felt something he hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. Hope for redemption, for a fresh start, for a chance to make amends for past mistakes. But as they discussed the details of their plan to find Ryan, Garrett couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension. He knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning of a difficult and potentially dangerous journey. A journey that could cost him everything, or give him back everything he had lost. When they left the restaurant hours later, the Chicago night air was full of promise and unspoken danger. Garrett watched Charlotte get into her car, waving goodbye. As he walked back to his own vehicle, he wondered if he was ready for what was to come. Ready or not, he knew he had no choice. It was time to face his past, to find his son, and maybe, just maybe, to rebuild the future he had so foolishly thrown away. Charlotte's office was smaller than Garrett had expected. Located on the third floor of an old building in downtown Chicago, the space was cramped but organized, with meticulously stacked files and a bulletin board covered in photos and notes. It was a clear reminder of how Charlotte's life had changed, as had his. So this is where the magic happens, Garrett asked, trying to ease the tension with a smile. Charlotte laughed softly, gesturing for him to sit down. It's not exactly the headquarters of Mason Enterprises, but it serves the purpose. The mention of his old company made Garrett cringe internally, but he kept the smile on his face. It's perfect, much more welcoming than any office I've ever had. Charlotte sat down behind her desk, opening a laptop. Well, let's get to work. Over the last few weeks, I've managed to gather some information about Ryan's whereabouts. Garrett's heart raced. Since their dinner a few weeks ago, Charlotte had immersed herself in the search for Ryan, using her contacts and investigative skills. Garrett, for his part, had kept his promise to reveal everything about the collapse of Mason Enterprises. What did you find out? He asked, leaning forward. Charlotte turned the laptop so that he could see the screen. Ryan has been careful, but not as careful as you think. I traced some suspicious transactions to a bank account in the Cayman Islands. Garrett frowned. That's not unusual for someone wanting to hide money. No, Charlotte agreed, but that's what's interesting. She clicked on another window, revealing a series of hotel reservations. These bookings were made using an alias, but the spending pattern matches what we know about Ryan's habits. Garrett studied the information, feeling a mixture of pride at Charlotte's skill and pain at seeing how his son was living. Where is he now? Charlotte hesitated for a moment. According to the last booking, he's here in Chicago. The shock hit Garrett like a punch in the gut. Here. But why? Why would he go back to the scene of the crime? I'm not sure, Charlotte admitted, but I think I know where we can find him. Over the next few hours, they worked out a plan. Ryan had apparently booked a room at the Peninsula Hotel, one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. The irony didn't escape Garrett. It was the same hotel where he used to host important clients. We can't just break into his room, Garrett argued. Charlotte shook her head. No, but we can observe. If we confirm that it really is him, we can decide our next move. As they discussed the details, Garrett couldn't help but notice how well they worked together. It was like old times, like when they were planning the future of Mason Enterprises, only now they were on the other side of the law. As night fell, they prepared for their surveillance mission. Charlotte grabbed a long-range camera and some listening equipment, while Garrett felt strangely useless. Is there anything I can do? He asked, feeling out of place in this new world of clandestine investigation. Charlotte smiled gently. Yes, you can be my extra eyes. No one knows Ryan better than you. Her words hit him hard. It was true, he should know Ryan better than anyone. But did he really? If he did, how could he not have foreseen the betrayal? They left the office and headed for the Peninsula Hotel. Charlotte parked her car discreetly across the street with a clear view of the main entrance. The hours passed slowly. Garrett watched every face that entered and left the hotel, his heart leaping at every young man who resembled Ryan. Charlotte, meanwhile, methodically took photos, comparing them with the last known images of Ryan. It was around midnight that Garrett saw him. There, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. That man in the navy blue suit. Charlotte quickly focused her camera. Are you sure? Garrett nodded, unable to look away. Ryan looked older, tougher, but he was still unmistakably his son. He watched as Ryan handed the car keys to the valet and walked into the hotel, seemingly without a care in the world. That's him, Charlotte confirmed, reviewing the photos. What do you want to do now, Garrett? He was silent for a long moment, a storm of emotions roaring inside him. Anger, hurt, confusion, and surprisingly, a touch of perverse pride at his son's cunning. We need to confront him, Garrett finally said, but not here, not now. We need a plan. Charlotte nodded, starting the car. Let's go back to the office and think of something. Now that we know where he is, we can be more strategic. As they drove back to Charlotte's office, Garrett found himself lost in thought. Seeing Ryan, even from afar, had brought up all the emotions he had tried to suppress over the last few months. Charlotte, he said softly, what if he doesn't want to see me? What if it's too late to put things right? She took one hand off the steering wheel and placed it on his. Garrett, it's never too late to try. Remember us. We thought it was too late, but here we are. Her words brought a lump to Garrett's throat. He squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her presence, for her strength. Back at the office, they began to map out a plan to approach Ryan. But as the night wore on, Garrett couldn't help feeling that they were on the brink of something dangerous. Ryan was no longer the boy he knew. He was a man capable of betraying his own father. As the sun began to rise over Chicago, illuminating the office with a soft light, Garrett looked at Charlotte. She was tired but determined, still working furiously on her laptop. Charlotte, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, thank you for all this. She looked up, a tired smile on her lips. Don't thank me yet, Garrett. This is just the beginning. And as they continued to plan, Garrett knew she was right. It was only the beginning. the beginning of a journey that could either redeem him or destroy him completely. But with Charlotte by his side, for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The Peninsula Hotel stood imposingly against the Chicago sky, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Garrett adjusted the tie Charlotte had insisted he wear, feeling uncomfortable in a suit for the first time in months. Beside him, Charlotte checked her phone one last time. "Remember the plan," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of tension. "We'll meet him in the lobby. Stay calm, no matter what." Garrett nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. After days of planning and observation, they had finally decided to confront Ryan. The idea was to take him by surprise in a public place, where he would be less likely to make a scene. They entered the hotel, the opulence of the lobby reminding Garrett painfully of his previous life. They found a discreet spot near the bar, from where they could watch the elevators. "There," Charlotte whispered, nudging Garrett gently. Ryan stepped out of the elevator, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly groomed. He looked confident, carefree, as if he didn't carry the weight of having betrayed his own father. Before Garrett could hesitate, Charlotte gently pushed him forward. "Now," she murmured. On shaky legs, Garrett approached his son. "Ryan," he called, his voice firmer than he expected. Ryan froze, his eyes widening in shock for a moment before narrowing in suspicion. "Dad," he said coldly, "what an unpleasant surprise." "We need to talk," Garrett said, keeping his voice low. "About what happened, about the money." Ryan laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "There's nothing to talk about. You lost, I won. That's how it works in the business world. Didn't you teach me that?" The words hit Garrett like a slap. Before he could reply, Charlotte approached, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Ryan," she said softly. "Long time no see." Ryan's face contorted in confusion for a moment before recognition dawned. "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" "Helping your father," she replied simply. "Ryan, please, let's talk in private. There's a lot that needs to be said." For a moment, it looked as if Ryan was going to refuse. His eyes raced around the lobby, as if looking for an escape route. But then, surprisingly, he nodded. "All right, but not here, my room." As they followed Ryan to the elevator, Garrett exchanged a worried glance with Charlotte. This wasn't part of the plan. Going to Ryan's room would put them at a disadvantage, but refusing could cause them to miss this chance. The room was a luxurious suite with a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Ryan poured himself a drink from the minibar, offering nothing to his guests. "So," he said, taking a seat in a leather armchair, "what do you want?" Garrett took a deep breath, trying to control the mixture of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I want to understand, Ryan. Why? Why did you do it?" Ryan laughed again, that same cold sound. "Why? Do you really need to ask? You spent years teaching me to be ruthless in business, to do whatever it took to win. I just followed your example." "I never—" Garrett began, but Ryan interrupted him. "You've never what? Never betrayed anyone? Never stepped on someone to get to the top?" His eyes turned to Charlotte. "Ask her about that." Charlotte leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Ryan, no one here is innocent. We've all made mistakes. But what you did, this goes beyond business. It's about family." "Family?" Ryan sneered. "What family? The one my father abandoned for money and power, or the one he built on lies and cheating?" Garrett felt as if every word was a knife in his heart. "Ryan, I know I've made mistakes, a lot of mistakes, but you're my son. I love you." "Love?" Ryan laughed bitterly. "Love didn't pay the bills, did it, Dad? It didn't build empires." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of hurt and resentment. Garrett looked at his son, really looked, and saw not only the anger and bitterness, but also the deep pain behind them. "Ryan," he said softly, "I failed you. As a father, as an example, I put business above everything, including you and Charlotte. And now I've lost everything. But the only thing I really care about losing is you." The words seemed to take Ryan by surprise. For a moment, his mask of indifference wavered, revealing a glimpse of the boy Garrett had once known. Charlotte approached, her voice gentle. "Ryan, we're not here to judge you or to demand anything. We're here because, despite everything, we're family, and family forgives." Ryan stood up abruptly, turning towards the window. When he spoke, his voice was shaky. "It's too late. I did things that can't be undone." Garrett stood up, taking a hesitant step towards his son. "It's never too late, Ryan. Believe me, I learned that the hard way." Slowly, Ryan turned around. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. What if I don't know how to go back?" At that moment, Garrett saw not the man who had betrayed him, but the frightened boy who used to run into his arms after a nightmare. Without thinking, he crossed the distance between them and pulled Ryan into a hug. For a tense moment, Ryan went rigid. Then, with a muffled sob, he surrendered to the embrace, his shoulders shaking with long-suppressed emotions. Charlotte watched the scene, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew that this was only the beginning. There was much to be resolved, much to be forgiven. But it was a beginning. As father and son reconciled, the sun began to set over Chicago, casting the room in golden hues. It was a new chapter opening up, a chance for redemption not just for Garrett, but for all of them. But as night fell, none of them realized that their actions had not gone unnoticed. In another room of the hotel, a man watched through a hidden camera, a cold smile forming on his lips. The Mason family's reconciliation was just the start of a much bigger game, one that threatened to destroy everything they had just rebuilt. Dawn was painting the Chicago sky in shades of pink and orange when Garrett woke up, disoriented for a moment in the unfamiliar luxury of the Peninsula Hotel suite. The events of the night before came flooding back. The confrontation, the tears, the hesitant reconciliation. Ryan was asleep on the sofa, his face younger and more vulnerable in sleep. Charlotte had left late at night, promising to return in the morning. Garrett got up silently, walking over to the window to watch the city waking up. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. Garrett opened it, finding Charlotte with a tray of coffee and a folded newspaper under her arm. "Good morning," she whispered, stepping inside. "How is he?" Garrett shrugged, picking up a cup of coffee. "Still asleep? It was an intense night." Charlotte nodded, her eyes softening. "And you? How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I don't know," Garrett admitted. "Relieved, scared, hopeful, all at the same time." They sat down at the table, Charlotte unfolding the newspaper. Her face suddenly paled. "Garrett," she said, her voice tense, "I think we have a problem." She turned the paper over to him. On the front page, a headline screamed, "Mason Scandal Revived. New Testimony Implies Ex-CEO." Garrett felt the blood run cold in his veins as he read the article. Apparently, a former Mason Enterprises employee had come forward with new evidence, suggesting that Garrett was aware of the fraudulent activities long before the company collapsed. "That's not true," Garrett muttered, his mind spinning. I know," Charlotte interrupted him gently, "but it complicates things." A movement on the sofa alerted them that Ryan was waking up. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking disoriented for a moment before reality hit him. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing Garrett and Charlotte's tense expressions. Garrett hesitated, but Charlotte pushed the newspaper towards Ryan. "We have a situation," Ryan read the headline, his face turning pale. "That doesn't make sense," he said, looking at Garrett. "I know you didn't know. I was very careful to—" He stopped abruptly, realizing what he was about to admit. Garrett felt a twinge of pain, but pushed it aside. There were more pressing problems now. "Who is this ex-employee?" Garrett asked, turning to Charlotte. She consulted the article. "A Marcus Whelan. It says here that he was a mid-level manager in the finance division." Ryan frowned. "I remember him. He was ambitious, always trying to get the attention of the executives." Do you think he could have been involved in the scam? Charlotte asked. Ryan shook his head. No, he wasn't in the inner circle. But he always seemed resentful. Garrett stood up, walking across the room. That doesn't make sense. Why would he show up now? And with what evidence? A heavy silence fell over the room, everyone lost in their own thoughts. It was Charlotte who finally broke the silence. We need to be proactive, she said, her tone professional. Ryan, do you have any information that might contradict Whelan's allegations? Ryan hesitated, exchanging a glance with Garrett. I might have something, but using it would mean admitting my own involvement. Garrett felt his heart squeeze. Ryan, no, I can't let you sacrifice yourself for me. Dad, Ryan said, his voice firm, I caused this. Let me help fix it. Charlotte interrupted them. Before we make any drastic decisions, we need to know exactly what Whelan has. I have some contacts in the police department who can give us more information. As they discussed their options, Garrett couldn't help but notice how well Ryan and Charlotte worked together, complementing each other's ideas. It was as if the lost years had never existed. Determined to act, they prepared to leave the hotel. But when Garrett opened the door to the suite, he was faced with an unpleasant surprise. Mr. Mason, said a man in a suit, flashing a badge. I'm Detective Ramirez. We have some questions for you. Garrett felt panic rise in his chest, but he kept his composure. Of course, Detective. What's this about? New evidence has come to light in the Mason Enterprises case, Ramirez replied, his eyes moving to Ryan and Charlotte. And who are these people? Before Garrett could answer, Charlotte stepped forward, holding out her hand. Charlotte Parker, private investigator. I'm assisting Mr. Mason in this matter, Ramirez raised an eyebrow. And the young man? Ryan hesitated for a moment before speaking. Ryan Mason. I'm Garrett's son. The detective looked surprised for a moment, but recovered quickly. Well, that's interesting. Mr. Mason, I'd like you to accompany us to the police station for a few questions. Garrett felt fear threaten to overwhelm him, but Charlotte's gentle touch on his arm calmed him down. All right, Detective. But I'd like my lawyer to be present. Lawyer? Ramirez asked, looking at Charlotte. Yes, Charlotte replied without hesitation. I'm a lawyer as well as an investigator. I'll be representing Mr. Mason. Ramirez nodded reluctantly. Very well. Let's go, then. As they followed the detective, Garrett exchanged worried glances with Ryan and Charlotte. He knew they were entering dangerous waters, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. In the elevator, Charlotte whispered to Ryan, I need you to make some calls. Find out everything you can about Marcus Whelan. Ryan nodded, determination shining in his eyes. Consider it done. As the elevator doors opened into the lobby, Garrett took a deep breath. He didn't know what awaited him at the police station, but he was ready to face it. With his son and Charlotte by his side, he felt he had a chance to fight, not just for his freedom, but for his redemption. As they got into the police car, Garrett didn't notice the man watching from afar, talking discreetly on the phone. They're moving, the man muttered. The plan is in motion. The game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than any of them could have imagined. The interrogation had already lasted 3 hours. The cold, impersonal room at the police station seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Garrett Mason, sitting rigidly in a metal chair, kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, avoiding Detective Ramirez's penetrating gaze. Charlotte, sitting next to Garrett, maintained a calm and professional posture, but her mind was working frantically, analyzing every question, every insinuation made by the investigators. Mr. Mason, Ramirez began again, his voice tired but determined. I'm going to ask you one more time. When exactly did you become aware of the fraudulent activities within Mason Enterprises? Garrett sighed, running a hand over his tired face. As I said, Detective, I didn't know anything until it was too late. By the time I found out, the company was already on the verge of collapse. Ramirez tapped the table with a file. We have Mr. Whelan's statement to the contrary. He claims that you were aware of everything at least 6 months before the scandal broke. Charlotte intervened, her voice firm. Detective, you are aware that statements without concrete evidence are not sufficient for an indictment, right? Where is the evidence that corroborates Mr. Whelan's allegations? Ramirez glared at Charlotte. We're working on it, Mrs. Parker. But I must remind you that your client is only here for questioning. He hasn't been charged. Yet, the emphasis on the last word didn't go unnoticed. Garrett felt a shiver run down his spine. Just then, there was a knock on the door. A young officer entered, whispering something in Ramirez's ear. The detective frowned, clearly disturbed by the information. It looks like we have a new situation, Ramirez said, standing up. I'm going to have to stop this interrogation for the time being. Mr. Mason, don't leave town. We'll be in touch. As soon as Ramirez left, Charlotte turned to Garrett. Something's happened. We need to find out what it is. They left the interrogation room, meeting Ryan in the corridor, his face a mixture of concern and relief. Dad, Charlotte, are you all right? Garrett nodded, hugging his son briefly. We are. But what's going on? Why did they interrupt the interrogation? Ryan looked around, making sure no one was listening. It's Whelan, he whispered. He's disappeared. Charlotte's eyes widened. What do you mean, disappeared? My contacts informed me that he didn't show up for a scheduled meeting with the prosecutors this morning. When they went to his apartment, they found signs of a struggle. Garrett felt the blood freeze in his veins. My God, do you think... Don't jump to conclusions, Charlotte interrupted him, her analytical mind already at work. This could be good or bad for us. On the one hand, without Whelan, they lose their main witness. On the other, we could be suspects, Garrett added, the realization hitting him like a punch in the gut. Ryan shook his head vigorously. No, that's ridiculous. You were here the whole time. Yes, but we don't have an alibi for last night, Charlotte mused. We need to be careful from now on. They left the police station, the cold Chicago air welcoming them like a slap in the face. As they walked toward Charlotte's car, Garrett couldn't help but notice a black sedan parked across the street, with a man behind the wheel watching them intently. Charlotte, he muttered, I think we're being followed. She nodded almost imperceptibly. I've noticed. Don't look directly at him. Let's act normally. They got into Charlotte's car, the silence heavy between them. As soon as they started moving, the black sedan started its engine. Where are we going? Ryan asked from the back seat. Charlotte kept her eyes on the road, but her mind was racing. We need somewhere safe to think. We can't go back to the hotel. It's too obvious. I know a place, Garrett said suddenly. An old warehouse in the south of the city. We used to use it for storage, but it was forgotten about when the company expanded. I doubt anyone remembers it now. Charlotte nodded, making a sharp turn to try and throw off the car following them. Good. Take us there. As they navigated the streets of Chicago, trying to lose their pursuer, Garrett couldn't help thinking about how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. Just a few days ago, he was a lone app driver, struggling to make ends meet. Now, he was in the middle of a conspiracy, with his son and ex-girlfriend by his side, on the run from a mysterious pursuer. Finally, after several evasive maneuvers, they arrived at the old warehouse. The place was dusty and abandoned, but it offered the refuge they needed. Okay, Charlotte said, closing the door behind them. Let's recap what we know. Whelan is missing, possibly kidnapped. Someone is following us, and the authorities are about to charge Garrett with fraud. Ryan leaned against an old desk. That doesn't make sense. Why would someone kidnap Whelan, and who's following us? Garrett closed his eyes, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Suddenly, a distant memory popped into his mind. Wait a minute, he said, opening his eyes. Before all this happened, before Ryan even... Well, you know, there was an attempted hostile takeover of Mason Enterprises. Charlotte leaned forward, interested. By whom? A conglomerate called Blackstone Industries. They were ruthless, but we managed to repel them. Or at least we thought we had. Ryan frowned. Do you think they might be behind this? Garrett shook his head slowly. I don't know, but it's the only thing that makes sense. If they manage to discredit me completely, they could acquire what's left of Mason Enterprises for a pittance. Charlotte started pacing back and forth, her mind working quickly. That would explain Whelan's disappearance. If he was working for them and threatened to say too much, they'd silence him, Ryan added, a shiver running down his spine. Garrett felt nauseous at the implications. My God, what have we gotten ourselves into? Charlotte stopped walking, turning to face them with determination in her eyes. It doesn't matter what we're in for. What matters is how we get out of it. We need hard evidence linking Blackstone to all of this. Ryan stood up, a new energy in his posture. I can help with that. I still have some contacts in the corporate world. I can do some discreet probing. Garrett looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. Ryan, are you sure? That could be dangerous. Ryan smiled sadly. Dad, I'm already up to my neck in it. Besides, it's time I started making up for my mistakes. Charlotte nodded approvingly. Good. Ryan, you take care of it. Garrett and I will try to find Whelan. If he's still alive, it might be our best chance of proving his innocence. As they worked out their plan, Garrett felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. They were entering dangerous territory, facing forces far greater than themselves. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. He had his son back and Charlotte by his side. Looking at the two of them, Garrett made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let them down again. It was time for Garrett Mason to redeem himself, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the people he loved. The sun was beginning to set over Chicago, casting long shadows through the dusty windows of the warehouse. A new battle was about to begin, and the fate of all of them hung by a thread. Night fell over Chicago, the city pulsing with its usual energy, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its shadows. In the old abandoned warehouse, Garrett, Charlotte, and Ryan were preparing for what could be the most crucial night of their lives. Everything ready? Charlotte asked, checking her equipment one last time. She had turned a corner of the warehouse into a makeshift operations center, with laptops, radio scanners, and maps of the city spread out on a makeshift table. Garrett nodded, adjusting the bulletproof vest Charlotte had insisted he wear. Ready as I'll ever be. Ryan, who had spent the last few hours on frantic calls with his contacts, hung up his cell phone with a sigh. I got some information. Blackstone Industries has a warehouse in the port area. There have been rumors of unusual activity there in the last 24 hours. Great work, son, Garrett said, the pride evident in his voice. Charlotte marked the location on the map. It's our best bet to find Whelan, but we need to be extremely careful. If Blackstone really is behind this, they won't hesitate to silence us permanently. The weight of that statement hung over them for a moment. Garrett looked at his son and Charlotte, feeling a wave of guilt and determination. You don't have to do this. It's my battle, not yours. Ryan put a hand on his father's shoulder. No, Dad, it's our battle now. We're in it together. Charlotte nodded in agreement. Besides, she added with a small smile, someone needs to keep you two out of trouble. The moment of levity was interrupted by the shrill sound of the radio scanner. A choppy voice reached them. Suspect located, port area. All units respond. They exchanged alarmed glances. It's now or never, Charlotte said, grabbing her keys. Let's go. The drive to the port area was tense, every shadow looking like a potential threat. When they arrived, the place was a chaos of siren lights and running officers. Damn, Ryan muttered. How are we going to get through this? Charlotte parked the car a safe distance away. I have an idea, she said, reaching into her bag for something. It was a badge, her old private detective badge. Stay here, I'll try to find out what's going on. Garrett and Ryan watched anxiously as Charlotte approached the scene, her badge in hand. After a few minutes talking to an officer, she returned, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Good news and bad news, she said, getting into the car. The good news is that they found Whelan. He's alive. And the bad news? Garrett asked, dreading the answer. He's in a critical condition in hospital, and she hesitated. He mentioned your name, Garrett, before he lost consciousness. The silence that followed was deafening. Garrett felt as if the world was collapsing around him again. They think I tried to kill you, he said, not really asking. Charlotte nodded somberly. It's their theory at the moment, but we have a chance. If we can prove Blackstone's involvement before Whelan wakes up and possibly incriminates him, we can turn the tables. Ryan leaned forward. Blackstone's warehouse. There must be some evidence there. It's too risky, Garrett protested. If we get caught, it's our only chance, Dad, Ryan insisted. We can't let them get away with this. Charlotte started the car. Ryan's right. It's time to end this once and for all. They headed for the Blackstone warehouse, Garrett's heart hammering in his chest. When they arrived, the place looked deserted, but a dim light shone through a window on the second floor. I'm going in, Charlotte said, checking her gun. You two stay here and be my eyes. No, Garrett said firmly. We'll go in together. Charlotte stared at him for a moment before nodding. All right. Ryan, you keep watch. Any suspicious movement? Let us know immediately. Carefully, Garrett and Charlotte sneaked into the warehouse. The interior was dark and silent, full of boxes and equipment. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing menacingly. On the second floor, they found a door ajar, light escaping through the cracks. Muffled voices came from inside. Charlotte signaled Garrett to remain silent as they approached. The plan went wrong. Mason should have been arrested today, a male voice said. Calm down, replied another voice, deeper and more authoritative. Whelan is out of the picture. Without him, they have nothing on Mason. What if he wakes up? What if he talks? Then we'll make sure he doesn't wake up. Garrett's blood ran cold when he heard those words. He looked at Charlotte, who nodded silently. She held up 3 fingers, counting down. 3, 2, 1. Charlotte kicked open the door, her gun in her hand. Police! Nobody move! Chaos ensued. 2 men in suits tried to flee, but Garrett, acting on instinct, knocked one of them down with a well-placed punch. Charlotte managed to overpower the other, handcuffing him quickly. Garrett, she shouted, the briefcase on the table. He threw himself across the table, grabbing a folder full of documents. His heart almost stopped when he saw the contents. Irrefutable proof of the Blackstone conspiracy, including orders to fabricate evidence against him and silence Whelan. Sirens began to sound in the distance. Ryan must have called for reinforcements. It's over, Charlotte said, a smile of relief on her face. We did it. The next few hours passed in a blur of testimony, statements, and shocking revelations. The Blackstone conspiracy was exposed, clearing Garrett completely. Whelan, when he finally woke up in hospital, confirmed everything, admitting his reluctant role in the scheme. Days later, Garrett found himself in his old office at Mason Enterprises, now practically empty. The company was to be sold, but this time on his terms. So, what are you going to do now? Charlotte asked, entering the room. Garrett turned around, a small smile on his face. Start again, but this time, the right way. Ryan entered just behind Charlotte. Dad, I wanted to apologize for everything. Garrett crossed the room, pulling his son into a tight hug. There's nothing to apologize for. We're in this together, remember? When they parted, Garrett looked from Ryan to Charlotte, feeling a wave of gratitude and love. Actually, he said, I was thinking of starting a new business. Something smaller, more ethical, and I'd like you two to be part of it. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on her lips. Are you sure you want a mixed business and, well, whatever we have here? Garrett laughed, taking her hand. Charlotte, after everything we've been through, I think we can handle anything. Ryan faked a grimace. Just don't start dating in front of me, okay? The 3 of them laughed, the sound echoing through the empty office. Outside, the sun was setting over Chicago, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Garrett Mason looked out of the window at the city that had almost destroyed him and was now offering him a second chance. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, But with his son and Charlotte by his side, he was ready to face any challenge. After all, he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. True wealth lay not in the numbers in a bank account, but in the people we love and who love us back. And so, with a heart full of hope and determination, Garrett Mason turned his back on his past and embraced his future, a bright future, full of possibilities and, above all, love.